Okay, everybody, if you can all take a seat, that'd be great. Welcome back to Branding and Marketing Communications. I'm just going to pass around a register again. Please sign it if you do. Also, if your name's not on the register, just add it to the bottom. It's fine. Welcome back. So, just to remind you all, I'm Robert Cluley. I'm the module leader for this course. You've got my contact details on the slide. Please do feel free to get in touch if you've got any questions or comments or concerns. A couple of housekeeping things. I'm a little bit sick this week, so I apologise if I sort of pass out or fall over. Just take me to the hospital. I should be okay. It's just a little cold, but yeah, I might flag halfway through the class. In terms of the communication that I've had from you guys this week, not been too much, but I think a few people have started to think about your assignments, which is great. One of the questions I've had from a couple of people is, last week you might remember I showed you a sample of a good assignment, what a good assignment looked like. And some students have emailed and said, well, that sample looked like it had focused on quite a specific area within some literature, which it did. And the question that was asked was, should you start with that specific area within the literature and then do your literature review on that very specific area? And I think a lot of the questions that I get about the assignment sort of go about it the wrong way. So the way you do a literature review is typically you have a lot of literature and you start reading into it, and then you realise that within this big literature there's actually lots of different areas of research. And sometimes there's links between the areas of research, and sometimes there isn't links between the areas of research. Sometimes they might use the same theory. Sometimes they might use the same method. Sometimes they might be focusing in on a particular bit of the theory, drawing on different sections of the research. Now, the question, should I focus on one of these areas of research at the start, suggests you know what they are. But the process of doing a literature review is precisely about identifying them. Okay? So when if you look at the reading lists that we've compiled, for each of the topics, they're not all the same. They all have different aspects of the literature. And students that do a good literature review will begin to recognise that there are different schools of thought or different themes in the literature, and they'll represent that in their literature review. So the example of work that we looked at last week, really briefly, was very good because the student had demonstrated that they had read the broad literature, and within that literature they recognised there were several themes, and then they focused just on one theme, and that's fine. And all you have to do in your literature review is describe that's what you're doing. So say, for example, within the cultural values research, there are different themes. Some look at the representations of the good life. Some people look at the representations of different genders. Within the representation of gender, there's a particular focus on the way that women or females are represented. That's going to be the focus of my literature review. That's fine to do that. It's perfectly fine. In fact, it's really good. Because to get to that point, you must have understood the literature, organised it in your head, and then focused in on something. Does that make sense? But that's a different way of going about it than saying at the start, I'm going to focus in on something, and I'm just going to review that, like before you've even done any reading about anything. So think of a literature review, it's like a funneling process, or a sorting out process. So it's not so much about picking a specific topic at the start, before you've done any reading, or any research or any thinking. Rather, you can only pick a specific topic once you've done some reading and research. Okay? Was there a question?
So, do we need to focus on specific aspects of the complications?
You can do. You don't have to, right? So, there's different. One way of doing a literature review is to literally describe each of those topics. Now, the problem with doing that is you've got a word limit. So if there's lots of topics, you might not be able to do all of them. So you're going to have to make some choices. Maybe if there's 5 or 6 topics, and you've got 3,000 words, including references, you're only going to have a couple of hundred words for each topic, which isn't a lot of depth. So if you want to demonstrate if you remember the criteria, one of the criteria is the depth of understanding. If you do too many topics, you just won't be able to demonstrate sufficient depth. So one way around that is to pick just one topic and focus in on that. That's fine. Another way around it is to say, these are the main 3 topics, and although there is these other ones, I'm not going to talk about them in this literature review. Or you say, these 3 topics are the same because they all have the same theory or method. So, although they look different, they're not, and I'm going to talk about that in my literature review. That's fine as well. Okay?
So, if the literature has the same theory or use the same methodology, we can mention that. Or do they focus on different aspects? And another question is about if the literature contains citation from the other authors. So as well as the second-hand resources, do we need to cite?
Okay, so the question, if you couldn't hear, is when you're reading into the literature, you'll often find people refer to other literature. Do you then need to go and read that other literature, or can you just use it as a second-hand citation? So you've not read the papers, but someone else has read it and told you what it says. So, practically speaking, no, let's put it in in a perfect world, yes, you would go and read all the literature. We don't live in a perfect world. You have to make choices. So you have to make choices as to what's important and what's going to add value to your research project. Now, if all of the papers that you're reading refer to a couple of other papers, and all of those refer to one paper, or one theory or one approach, and you don't bother reading it, that doesn't really show that you've really gone into depth of understanding. Right? So you've got to think strategically, because often the literature will be arranged like this. So we don't expect you to, we know you've got limited time available to do the assignment. We don't expect you to have read everything, and some of the topics like processing theory and attitude theory, there's thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of research studies that you could read. But in those areas, you actually find often they refer just to 1 or 2 central core theories. So it would be good to have at least done a little bit of reading into those core theories. But we understand you're not going to read everything, so it's perfectly fine, in the real world, to rely on what somebody else said about something. If you want to do it, the preferred way of doing it, though, is to, if you're using somebody else's discussion of a text, to say that's what you're doing. So, for example, let's say attitude theory. We talked about the theory of planned behavioural reason and action in Group 2 as being underlying attitude research. Okay. Now, if somebody says blah, 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 blah about TRA in a paper that you've read, and you want to say, oh, that's a really good way of describing it, I'll use that, then just say, as described by whatever the author's name is, TRA is blah, blah. And you can put that in your own words, you can put it in a quotation. That's it.
So we can do this.
Yeah, that's good. And to be clear, this is preferable because what this says is you've actually read it and we want to give you credit for reading something. But so if you've read XX's paper, let us give you credit. Show us that you've read it by saying, I've read it. You're demonstrating that.
The reference list is included in the word count.
Yes. And let me explain why the reference list is included in the word count again, just for anybody who missed it. There's two reasons why the reference list is included in the word count. One is it's good to have a limit, and what can happen if, and it's the same with dissertations, sometimes students ask about putting things into an appendix. If something's important, it should be included in the word count. The other is, we want to force you to make a choice between how many references do you reference and how many do you discuss. So what sometimes people do is they'll do this. They'll go to their favourite search engine or database. They'll type in some broad words and they'll go, right, yeah, okay, this one looks like it's useful. And then they'll just put they'll do that. Right? Now, they haven't read it. It's clear to me they haven't read it because that's just such a generic statement. But what people are doing is thinking, I haven't read anything, but I want to support what I'm saying because it will look more persuasive. So I'll put a reference in that I haven't read. If you haven't read it, you haven't reviewed it, you don't care. Right? Sometimes what students will also do, and not just students, it can also be experienced academics, is they'll say, well, things look better if you have 2 or 3 people saying the same thing. But I can't read them all because why would I read 2 or 3 people saying the same thing? What I'll do is I'll just read one and then I'll put some more in the list and hope that if I put enough people in the list, the people marking will think I must have read them all. Okay? Now, doing this is not something we want to encourage on this course. If other people want to encourage you to do it, that's fine. This is bad academic work. This is bad scholarship. Right? Because what you're basically doing when you do this is you're saying, I know that I don't know what these things are saying, but I think if I put enough of them in there, everyone will pretend that I do. But I don't want that. I want you to just have actually read the things that you're writing about, because they're important, because you've started to read into the literature and you've realised that these people are important, and you've read it and understood it. So that's why we put the reference list in the word count, because it forces you to optimise how much do you reference, because the more you reference, the less word count you have to actually write about things. So we want you to reference only the essential things. Only the things you have actually read and that you're actually talking about. So if you're making like a generic statement like attitudes are important, you don't need to put a reference to that. If you're reviewing attitude research, we already know that attitudes are important because you've set it up. You might want to say why they're important, and you might take something from this literature. That would be fine. But just some generic statement of reference, waste of time, don't do it. So that's why the references are included in the word count, to force you to make choices about what to include. That's also good communication skills, particularly for marketing communications, where often you don't have a lot of time to talk to people. Now, in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about designing adverts. If you've got 5 seconds for your YouTube advert, you've only got 5 seconds. So you have to make a choice about what's really important and how can you really communicate effectively. Any other questions that have come to mind about the assignments at all?
I want to assure that you mentioned if we want to introduce the theory, so we need to, we also need to introduce the original history of the theory from the literature.
So the question is, if you're discussing a theory, As in, so how much do you need to go into the background to the theory? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Well, again, there's no hard and fast rule. If the theory is really important to what you're writing about, like in attitudes, the theory of reasoned action, the theory of planned behaviour is very important, you might want to have a sentence or two about where it came from. Did it come from marketing research? Has it been developed in a different area and then applied into branding? That could be important, right, for your understanding. So you should do that, contextualising the theory, but remember, your literature review is about the topic of your literature review. So if you spend all your time talking about the background to a theory, you're not reviewing the literature. Does that make sense? Now, if the background to the theory is a big part of the literature, then you should put it in your review.
If the definition of the theory is just one sentence from the literature to dive into.
Well, let me ask, why wouldn't, so the question was, if there's a definition of a theory in the literature, that sort of everybody has the same sentence in all their papers, do you need to put that into your literature review? Why wouldn't you do that? What would be the value of not doing it?
I mean, do we need to reference just a sentence like the definition of the theory?
Why wouldn't you do that? What would be the benefit of not doing that?
Because it increases the number of the references.
By one, yeah. But if it's, so this is really good example, right? Okay, so do you want to add a reference in if everybody has the same quote to define the theory? Okay. Is that a waste of a reference? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, right. So if there's a standard definition that goes back to a particular author, clearly that's important. That's something which is essential to this. So your argument is if there's just one paper which has the definition of the theory upon which the whole literature is built, and you want to show you understood in depth that literature, that's the most important thing, right? The definition at the start. So that's not a waste of a reference. That's a very important reference. Because the theory is very important if it's just one definition of the theory. Any other questions just whilst we're talking about the assignment at all? No? Okay, well, there's plenty of opportunity, and like I say, if you've got any questions or any spring to mind, just send me an email. I'll try to answer them as quickly as I can, and I'll always feed back to the class. So last week, we moved on from looking at psychological theory, sociological theory, to cultural theories of branding and marketing communications. And we looked at 4 different areas within cultural theory of marketing communications. We started off with cultivation theory, which is one of the prominent theories within cultural theory research, which tells us that the more time people spend consuming media texts, the more they're likely to think that the world that's represented in those texts is like the real world. And we know that one of the most highly consumed cultural texts is advertising. So the application to advertising is that people spend many, many hours a day watching thousands and thousands of adverts and being exposed to them, whether that is in a high involvement central processing way, if you think back to psychological theories, or in a low involvement peripheral way. People still spend a lot of time being exposed to marketing communications, branding, and advertising. The cultivation theorists say the ways that the world is presented in branding, marketing, communications, and advertising is going to shape what people think. And researchers then try to look to see, well, what are the ways that the world is represented in branding, marketing, communications, and advertising? That's cultivation theory. Then we moved on to discuss a particular sort of branch of cultivation theory called cultural values research. Cultural values research starts from the same theoretical ideas as cultivation theory. We talked about this a lot last week, that cultivation theory describes the mechanism through which things work. Cultural values research looks at the content and focuses on the ways that brands and marketing communicators' desires to look positive shapes the kind of cultural values or ideas that they present in their texts. And again, we had a quick look at some of the empirical research there, which tracks trends in different types of cultural ideas or cultural values within branding and marketing communications. So we saw in the work of Richard Poley how there was this rise towards more youthful imagery in advertising. And the argument in cultural values research is that tells us something, that shapes the culture. If people are being exposed to advertising messages which are persuading them that it is good to be youthful, that's going to shape something about the culture. Then we looked at the movement of meaning model, which focuses on the ways that cultural meanings can be transferred onto brands through advertising, and vice versa, the way that brands can be transferred into cultural texts. We looked at the example of Grey Poupon mustard, and how it had this brand value that then got used in hip-hop music. It became a key element of that culture. One of the reasons for looking at the movement of meaning model is it's been really influential in the theory of icons. And the idea of icons is that many brands want to become an icon. An icon in cultural theory is something that represents something else. So the aim for many brands is to represent their product category or their consumers, such that when you think about drinking a cola-flavoured drink, you think about Coke, you don't think about Virgin Cola. Or if you think about using a search engine, you Google it rather than search for it. This is a brand becoming an icon, coming to represent the thing itself. And then finally, we looked at some more critical perspectives which question whether the ability of brands and marketing communications to cultivate particular values is always a good thing, or whether it has some damaging implications. Whether, for example, the ways that brands and marketing communications present beauty and attractiveness in such an unrealistic way that it actually has sort of damaging personal psychological effects on people, because they are looking at models in adverts and branding and wishing they looked like that, but they never can. And why can't they? Because the models themselves don't look like that, because they are airbrushed and edited to be made to look even more beautiful than they might be in the real world. So that's what we looked at last week, and we had quite a good discussion, and I thank everybody for their contributions to that discussion last week. I don't think I answered some of the questions last week very well, and it sort of bummed me out afterwards that I don't think I did too well on that. But one of the questions that I think was at the background of a number of the questions last week was an idea between nature and nurture. So a number of the questions said, well, is this sort of inbuilt into people? Is it inbuilt into people to want to value youth? Or particularly when we were talking about different gender roles or different images of beauty, there was a number of questions. Well, does it affect men and women differently? I don't think I answered that question very well, but I thought about it afterwards, and I think I answered it better, so I'll just quickly tell you what I was thinking. So what we did last week was try to describe cultural theory. Now there's a big clue in the name cultural theory. It's a theory about culture. That's what they're focusing on. So your questions about, is this inbuilt into people, are really great questions, but they're not answered in cultural theory, because cultural theory only focuses on culture. It doesn't focus on nature or biology. So really the questions were all a kind of good critique of cultural theory, is that sometimes it makes sense and you can set out a good argument, But then the question is always, well, where does culture stop and people's inbuilt biology start? This is particularly pertinent when it comes to things like gender, and it's a big hot topic in cultural theory at the moment, is whether gender is the same as sex. So whether it's the same to be a man or a woman, or male or female. I'm starting to not explain this very well, I think, but you can have male traits like being macho and aggressive, but you don't have to be a man to have those traits. So you can be biologically a man, but culturally male. Conversely, you can have traits which we often associate with female traits, but you don't have to be a woman to have those traits. When we start asking these questions about the relationship between culture and biology, it gets very, very confusing. So my kind of headline answer to a lot of the questions you asked last week is, I just put them to one side. If you're trying to understand what cultural theory is doing, it's not trying to explain biology. They're really great questions, but they're not helpful in understanding cultural theory. They're helpful in critiquing it, but it's always better to understand something before you critique it. Okay? I don't know if that answered the questions better, but like I said, I'm poorly. So, okay, so sorry. Today's aims. Today what we're going to do is move on to look at media theories. Theories of media. These are very different from the theories we've been looking at up to date, although they clearly, as we're going to see throughout the lecture, they relate to them. So psychological theory tries to explain branding and marketing communications' effects on individual consumers. So when we did the transmission model, we said you have a sender and you have a receiver. Like psychological theories look at the receiver. What happens inside the consumer's head once they've been exposed to some marketing communications? Sociological theories looks at groups of receivers. What happens to groups of people who might be the same in some way when they're exposed to advertising, branding, marketing communications? Cultural theory focuses more on the process of encoding messages. How do you get meaning from the wider culture and put it onto your brand? How do you become an icon? So it's sort of more on the sender side of things in terms of encoding the message, and the receiver in terms of how do they decode the message? Where does that meaning come from? But it's focusing more on the wider culture. What we've not looked at up to this date is the bit in the middle. The bit that does the sending. And this is sometimes called a media channel. Sometimes it's just called a media. That's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to focus on some of the theories around that media channel. So these are not theories about what happens to people, individual consumers, when they're exposed to branding and marketing communications. It's not about how do you encode a message effectively. It's about what's the role of the media channel that links the two together. So that's what we're going to try to do today. So we're going to look at some different theoretical starting points within media theory. And this might be a little bit different from sort of how you've talked about media if you've done advertising or branding or marketing in the past, because we're going to look at media theory itself, not marketing theories of media. Then I got to focus in on the kind of two main areas of the current media research, and that is focusing on understanding the effectiveness and workings of new media, and primarily in the research that means social media, digital media, and then critical analysis of those media types as well. So that's what I want to do today, those three things. Hopefully we'll get it done in time without having to rush, and hopefully there won't be another fire alarm that goes off. So why media theory? Well, clearly, if we follow that transmission model, that information processing model that we talked about in week 1, as our understanding of the communication process, all communication relies on some form of media, something which takes the message from the sender and delivers it or transmits it to the receiver. That might be a voice, right? That might be a microphone, that might be some writing, it might be a slide, it might be music, it might be a picture, it could be a smell, it could be anything, right? It might be a poem. Those are all ways of transmitting messages. So media theory tries to understand those different ways of transmitting messages. Are they all the same? Do they all work in the same way? Does it matter if I use a slide rather than my words? Media theory is an attempt to try to understand and theorize the effects of different types of media, different ways of transmitting a message. So that's what media theory is trying to do. So the central question is, well, how do different types of media channel actually transmit messages? What do they allow people to do? What don't they allow people to do? And one of the big applications for this in marketing and branding is not just understanding how, but understanding how best to reach consumers, which is the best media channel to express your message, to reach particular receivers. And in recent years, this area of research has really seen a resurgence, media theory, in marketing communications. For many years, going back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you almost never saw a discussion of media types in proper marketing communications research. They just assumed that people only saw adverts on television or in the newspaper. Maybe the radio, but they didn't really bother about that too much. So lots of the studies which look into processing theory will be based on experiments, and those experiments will show people print adverts, so newspaper adverts. And they don't consider that there might be a difference if you showed people an advert on a TV screen or on the internet, because they didn't have the internet then. So in recent years, practitioners have tried to understand the influence of different technologies, and this has driven academics to start focusing more and more on understanding the role and influence of media and different types of media. One of the best manifestations of this is a journal called the Journal of Interactive Media, which is an incredibly popular journal, which has only existed for a few years. Because up to that point, marketing researchers didn't really focus on media. They tended to be more psychological, maybe a little bit sociological, but increasingly a lot of research is being conducted now into understanding media, how different forms of media work and what they're best for. So that's why media theory. And I point this out because often media theory is often held up as being a sort of example of a pointless, useless, not practical theory. But actually in branding and marketing communications, it's really, 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 really practical. And as we're going to see in a couple of weeks' time, most of the changes in the marketing communications industry of recent decades have been driven by changes in the media, new media technologies. And lots of people that have made a lot of money haven't made it because they know how to develop really cool, engaging adverts, because they've developed different media technologies. So media theory is very, very practical and very important to understand. So let's just go through some different ideas in media theory and apply them as best we can to branding, marketing, communication. So there's a kind of marketing media theory, which you'll often see presented in marketing textbooks, which will be very descriptive. So it will say you have print media, broadcast media, digital media, interpersonal media. And it will just describe what those different examples of those types of media. They're useful terms to understand, but as a theory, that kind of marketing theory, which you see in marketing textbooks, like if you've read Kotler and things in other courses, it's not really a theory of anything. It just describes them. It just says print media uses print. Broadcast media uses broadcast media. That's technically it's a tautology, right? It's a definition in terms of itself. If you go into actual media theory, things start to look different. In actual media theory, the focus isn't on the type of media itself or the type of technology. The focus is usually on understanding the type of relationship that a media allows between a sender and a receiver. The technical name for this is mediation. So what form of mediation does a media allow? And when you think in those terms, you can start to develop a more theoretical and more in-depth understanding of different types of media. So instead of just saying broadcast media is broadcast media, and examples of broadcast media are television, you can start to think, well, what kind of relationships or mediation does broadcast media allow? Is that different from other types of media? Broadly speaking, there's 4 types of mediation discussed in media theory. There is a one-to-one relationship. So there's media which opens up a relationship between 2 people. So talking is a good example of that. You come to my office for a meeting, we talk, we can have a one-to-one communication. The telephone is another media which allows one-to-one communication. You can't telephone me, but you can telephone your friend, and you can talk to each other, one person to one person. It's a one-to-one media. Within one-to-one media, there's different relationships you can have. So you can have a direct relationship where the sender sends a message to somebody else. You have a two-way relationship where they send the message back to the other person and there's some feedback. So if I write you a letter, you can't communicate back without writing a letter of your own. A letter is a direct form of mediation. If I telephone you, once we've got that connection, I can talk to you, you can talk to me. It's a two-way relationship. So you have one-to-one media. For branding and marketing communications, one-to-one media is usually not something people are too bothered about. It's useful for personal selling and direct marketing. But the problem from a branding, marketing, communications perspective with one-to-one relationships is it's very inefficient because you essentially need a marketing communicator for every consumer. So if you want to sell millions and millions of products, you have to have millions and millions of people to communicate. So it's quite inefficient. So a lot of marketing communications, traditionally, it's been what's called a one-to-many relationship. A one-to-many relationship, where instead of opening up a channel between a sender and one receiver, it's a channel between one sender and lots of receivers. So can we think of an example of a one-to-many media? Sorry? Mobile ads, how come? Yeah, so the example here is television, which is probably a better example, and hopefully it'll become clear why. So in television, you broadcast, the sender broadcasts the same message, the same advert, to everyone watching television at that time. Everyone gets the same message. Again, in one-to-many media, sometimes it's possible to have a two-way relationship, but usually not. Usually with broadcast media, this is one of the flaws of them, is this is one-way relationship. So if you're watching television, all of you are watching the same TV show, right? And an advert comes on, you're all exposed to the same message. The advertiser has communicated the same message to all of you, Can you communicate back to the advertiser through the television? No. It's a one-way relationship. In terms of many of the theories of branding and marketing communications, a lot of them are based on studies of broadcast media. So you might want to think about that when you're reading into some of the literature. There's some of the questions we were asking earlier about understanding the context behind theories. A lot of the context behind theories traditionally was the idea that what brands were doing was sending one message to lots and lots of people who couldn't communicate back to them. So one-to-many media might be television, it could be a newspaper. Because if you all read the same newspaper, and on page 1 there's an advert, you've been exposed to the advert, you've all been exposed to the same message. Can you communicate back to the sender using a newspaper? No. So this is a one-to-many relationship. So you see how traditionally in marketing media theory we'd say print media is different from broadcast media. But actually thinking about the type of mediation, the type of relationship it forms, you realise it's not different at all. It does the same thing. Then we have many-to-many media. So these are media channels which allow lots of senders to communicate with lots of receivers, all at the same time, particularly all at the same time. So now, you start to get lots and lots of senders, all of whom have their own message, which they can communicate to lots of different people at the same time. Not just one sender, but lots of senders. Communicating to a mass of people, all at the same time. So a really good example of this, a typical example that's used, is something like social media platforms. Like a Twitter, like a social network, where you can have millions, potentially billions of people, all sending messages to other people through the media channel. So if we were all on Twitter, and I'm an advertiser, and you're an advertiser, and you're an advertiser, we can all be communicating at the same time to different people in the audience. Just slightly different from a newspaper. You can't have multiple adverts on top of each other on a newspaper. You have to have different pages. Slightly different from TV, where you have to have different channels if you want to communicate to different groups, but you typically can't communicate to the same people all at the same time. So that's many-to-many forms of mediation. One of the benefits of many-to-many forms of mediation is it's much easier to have two-way relationships. Because the senders and receivers, it's possible for lots of people to send and lots of people to receive. It's possible, essentially, for this person to become this person if they want to. So, when you're on social media, you don't just get messages, you can send messages at the same time. You can receive a message and then send the message back to somebody else. You can send it on to a new person. You could respond to that message to the original person, becoming the sender yourself. So if you go with me that a lot of the theories of branding and marketing communication have been based on broadcast media, where it was a one-way relationship, where there was one sender sending one message to lots of people, and then we start to think about many-to-many media, we might have to question whether those theories are completely applicable. And this is one of the things we're going to see later on in this lecture and throughout the course, that increasingly marketing theorists believe that many-to-many media, like social networks and digital media, fundamentally question many of the assumptions at the heart of marketing communications theories and practices. So we kind of need different theories and practices for many-to-many media. And then finally we have many-to-one media. This is theoretically possible. Practically there's fewer examples of it. The examples don't work out quite so well. So in a many-to-one media, you have many senders but they communicate one message to the consumer. Sort of seems a bit curious to think about. So what might that look like? Well, you could have many senders who all share the same message. So an example of that might be sometimes you get groups of brands come together to promote a message. So in the UK, a few years ago, we had a campaign that was called Buy British. So lots of brands who might be competing against each other in other platforms thought it was in their self-interest to come together to say just one message: buy British products, irrelevant of which brand you choose. It's better to buy British or to buy who you might be. So many senders, and they agreed on one message. That kind of works as an example, but it focuses on the message, not the form of mediation. The best example of the many-to-one mediation that I've been able to think of has been personalised messages that you can get on digital media platforms, where you can have different forms of the same message targeted to different consumers. So the messages are personalised, so you can have many messages. But what social media platforms and digital media platforms allow you to do is to target specific messages to specific individual consumers and audience members. So you're no longer broadcasting en masse to a big group of people, but on digital media platforms you can broadcast en masse to individual people. So you have kind of many senders sending one message to individual consumers. Like I say, it's much rarer to see in practice than many-to-one mediation. Yeah?
But that means one consumer can pick up one device from the massive sender.
Sorry.
But that means many senders send a similar message to one person, and that consumer can pick up many one device from that massive message.
Sort of. So the question is, does that mean that the consumer could choose the message that they're exposed to? Sort of, but remember that media theory is focusing on the bit between the two. The bit between the sender and the receiver. So it's more, is it possible for the form of mediation to allow many senders to communicate one message to the consumer, to an individual consumer? Now in practice, the way that works on, say, a social media platform is in two ways. One, you can often set some settings to define what kind of advertising and branding messages you might like to be exposed to. Like if you go into settings on your favourite social media, you can often say, I'm happy to receive targeted advertising, for example. The other, in many social media platforms, is they don't need your agreement to make that kind of targeting, so they can do it in terms of time. What time are you on the platform? They can send a particular message to somebody. Where are you? What's your location? They can send it to a particular individual. Or they can target your specific user account. So when we start thinking about many-to-one media, there's not as many examples, so we just kind of have to get very specific and technical to talk about it. So in a sense, you can kind of discount many-to-one media at the moment.
Is horizontal platform a kind of
horizontal portal platform. What's a horizontal portal platform?
Well, let's say a platform that's a WhatsApp provider platform for many restaurants or sellers to upload products on the website.
So give me an example. Like what? Yeah, oh, perfect, right, okay. So the question was, well, would a good example of a personalised platform be something like Airbnb, right? So you've all heard of Airbnb, where you have many senders, and they can communicate their messages to one individual? Possible. But here's the thing. On something like Airbnb, the individual goes in and they have a big list of things. The media doesn't just target one individual form. On something like on Google, for example, you can essentially have lots of people, lots of senders, lots of advertisers or brands, and they feed their messages into Google. And Google's analytics, these are big buzzwords, analytics and algorithms, pick one message tailored to the individual, and only show the individual that one message. Whereas on something like Airbnb, you as an individual go in and say, I'm looking for a room in London, and then you get a list of things and you can choose them. So that's more like this, where you can have a one-to-one relationship, but there's lots of different one-to-one relationships you can pick. In the example of a many-to-one, the receiver only gets one message, and they don't see anything else. Does that make sense?
So the networks can be many, lots of brands, different brands, and they can send the same message to the individual.
Yeah, but here's the important point. They all put their messages into the media. The media channel picks one of the messages and sends it to one consumer. It might pick a different message and send it to another consumer. It can pick a different message and send it to another consumer.
All the brands send the same messages.
No. I'm sorry, this was a confusing one.
I wonder if brands use email to contact with their customers.
Yeah.
I wonder, does email belong to one-to-one media or one-to-many media?
So the question is, email, where would you put email in this box? In these boxes, sorry. Well, email, to answer these questions, what media theorists would do, and I'll just be a media theorist for the time being, which I'm not, by the way, you have to try to understand the technology itself. So a lot of people use email to email one person, right? You email your friend, you email your parents, and you can do that. So you might think it's one-to-one media, because you can do one-to-one messaging. But what you can also do on email is you can send emails to lots of people all at the same time. So you could get an email list and send an email to everybody. I could go to a Moodle, and essentially it works through email. I send an email to Moodle. Moodle sends an email to all the class for me all at the same time. So there you go, so that's a one-to-many media. And really that's what it is. It is a one-to-many media. It's just you can choose, instead of sending the message to everybody, to send it to one person.
To me, it belongs to both.
No, I mean it is only a broadcast media. But you as the sender can choose. So an email, right? You're the sender, and you choose who to send it to. And if you want to, your many people could just be one person. Makes no difference to you, right? It's just an email address. But technically, the way the media works, that is the same as that. When you do an email and send it to one person, the media channel, the email system, doesn't matter whether you're sending it to one person or a million people. It's exactly the same. But you as the sender can choose whether it's one person, 2 people, 3 people, or everybody in your entire class, if you wanted to. So it's a broadcast media, a one-to-many.
And
media a B2C model. So what do you mean by B2C?
It means B2C model is a concept that personalized information.
But B2C, so you mean business to consumer.
Yeah. The PlayStation information of the platform is not personalized information.
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying, but it doesn't have to be. You know, this person at the end could be a consumer, but it could be a business customer. It doesn't matter in terms of the form of mediation. In terms of the examples of media which do it, it tends to be B2C, but it doesn't have to. There's nothing technically in this form of mediation that refers to consumers or others. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, we have a question. Sorry, guys, I can't hear the question. So, mobile ads. Okay, what about mobile ads? So, let's work with another example. A mobile phone. A mobile phone, by definition, technically, right, is capable of having different types of media on it. So when you make a phone call, a mobile phone works just like a normal telephone, and it's typically a one-to-one media. But if you go onto a web browser on your mobile phone, and you access your email account, you can send an email to 1 million people. So now it becomes, oops, not that, wrong one, sorry. It becomes a one-to-many, right? So it depends, when you say mobile phone, you need to be more specific. Mobile ads, yeah, but again, you need to be more specific because you can do mobile ads through SMS. Mobile ads through SMS is broadcast media. You get a list of telephone numbers, you write your SMS message, you send it all out to lots of people. Mobile ads targeting mobile devices when they're accessing the internet, which is probably what you mean, is more of a personalized media. Because there'll be a platform, like Google, that's an advertising platform, WeChat is an advertising platform, Facebook is an advertising platform, which lots of advertisers go to, and they say, when somebody comes on their mobile phone and they're browsing online, show them our advert. Okay? And the way that those platforms, at least Google and Facebook, work is they run an auction. So they say, which one of you is going to pay us the most money to send your message? Okay. So, in terms of how targeted advertising works, it can depend on lots of things. It can depend on location. It can depend on users provided or user supplied data. So when you set up your Facebook account and you say I'm a man or a woman, it uses that in your options as well as your location. When you set your relationship status, it uses that. When you start using those platforms, it gathers metadata, or what's sometimes called user-generated data. So if you're constantly searching on Google for babysitters, it can use that data to target specific individuals as well. Okay? Yes, exactly. Just one message. So, an example of this level of personalization, a final example hopefully, because we're only on like the third slide. Right, a final example, which I used to do, but I don't have the slides anymore. If you go into your favourite search engine, like Google is my favourite search engine, I use Google. If I type in a web search, it provides different search results for me than my girlfriend who sat on her computer next to me. So I only see mine, she only sees hers. Even for very simple things. This was discovered a few. This was discovered a few years ago when. Do you know what the Arab Spring is? Does anybody know what the Arab Spring is? So in 2010, there was a series of riots that took place in Middle East Arabic countries like Egypt, and the governments were overthrown. It's called the Arab Spring. And some advertising researchers discovered that if they typed in Egypt into Google, the top results was all about going on holiday to Egypt. Some of their colleagues that were more politically oriented researchers typed in Egypt, and they got all this information about how these riots and revolutions and governments being overthrown. Used the exact same search term on the exact same platform, got two completely different messages back, and would never have seen the other message unless they showed each other. This is what we mean by a one-to-many medium. A many-to-one medium, sorry. Thank you. Someone's awake. Is it personalises the message to just one person, and you don't see any of the messages. So you might think everybody is getting the same message as you, because you're not seeing what they're getting, because it's personalised. Okay? Good. So, can you see though, the message I want to take away from this is how when you start to think in terms of theorising the media in this way, rather than just as the typical marketing textbook will do, saying there's print, there's broadcast, there's personal sales. When you start to theorise the media, you start to realise there's lots of similarities between supposedly different types of media, different types of technologies. There's differences between things which look like they might be the same. And it starts to open up lots and lots of different understandings of the relationships between senders and receivers, between groups of senders and groups of receivers, than you just get if you just describe the media channels. As an example of this, we can think about, let's look at something like social media in particular. So this was a way of theorising social media platforms that was developed by Kaplan and Hanneman in about 2010, I think. So one of the things that they noticed was that in the early 2010s, a lot of researchers, and typically business and marketing researchers, were really interested in social media platforms because they were used to using broadcast, and then they thought many-to-many might be really cool. There's lots of reasons why they thought many-to-many might be cool, and we'll talk about them throughout some of the rest of the course. And so researchers said, well, are all social media platforms the same? What do we mean by social media platforms? So like when I just asked you about mobile, are all of the apps on a mobile apps? Not necessarily. And so they started to drill into social media and think, well, let's get a list of different social media platforms. Right? So we've got YouTube, Facebook, Wikipedia. We commonly describe them all as social media, but are they all the same? Do they all allow the same types of mediation? And they came up with this neat little matrix to sort of distinguish differences between them. So they said, one of the things that you can think about is how rich is the media channel? How much information does the social network allow the sender to communicate to the receiver? So how rich is the information that's sent across? They said, well, if you look at like a blog, what's your typical blog? Somebody just writes a diary, so it's just text. Or maybe on Instagram, it's just photographs. So that's just one type of way of coding a message, right? Text or photos. You look at a Wikipedia page. What's a Wikipedia page normally? Text, maybe some images, but often not. So in terms of the richness of the information that's conveyed is just textual. Then I said, in between that, you have a media level of richness. So something like Facebook, where you can put text messages, status updates, emoticons and emojis, pictures, videos. That starts to allow you to express yourself more richly. You have more choices. You're not just reliant on text, if you can have text, videos, and images. And then at the extreme end, you have, it was a few years ago, some kind of outdated examples. You have these kind of massive online platforms where you can have immersive experiences, like Fortnite, or there's gaming platforms that you might play where you can go in and it's not just text and a picture, but you can have sounds and you can be talking to people in real time, and you've got an avatar that's moving through a completely made-up world. That's an incredibly rich media experience because you have so many different ways of encoding messages. So they said you can distinguish social media platforms in terms of the richness of the media, or the different ways you can code messages is the way to think about that. But then you can also distinguish social media platforms in terms of how much the individual user has to reveal about themselves, how much they have to give on the social media platform. So that if you contribute to a Wikipedia page, you don't really have to say anything about you. You don't have to put on the social media page how old you are and such like on the Wikipedia page. If you have a blog where you're writing about your personal life, you're revealing a lot of information about yourself. So it's very high in what they call self-presentation or self-disclosure, how much information you're giving about yourself. But a blog, remember, doesn't let you use rich media, although over time you can start to do more rich media. I mean, like the original blogs were just literally just text. And then, you can work this through, right? Something like a YouTube video, you can just put a YouTube video up of my lecture, and you can put my lecture on YouTube if you recorded it. It doesn't say anything about you, it might say something about you. So you're not having to reveal much information about yourself. You can, and something like a vlog which combines the personal information of a blog with a YouTube video obviously does. But compare that, a YouTube video that you posted of your favourite band or something. So this is like Facebook, where you have to reveal information about yourself. That's the whole point of having a Facebook account. You have to give a lot of information. So, again, what I want to get across is, in media theory, there's different ways of theorizing media. One is in terms of mediation, but then you can start to get different theorizations within that. So focusing just on social media as a type of mediation, you can then start to introduce different frameworks. So the framework here, social presence, media richness, and self-preservation, allows these researchers to start to distinguish different types of social media. And the point for advertisers would be, if you wanted to do the type of targeted advertising, personalised message that we were talking about before, which of these do you think you'd use? Something which has high self-presentation or low self-presentation? Which media do you think would be better suited to it? High, right? Because you need information about the individual to personalise the message to them. If you've got a single message that you wanted to communicate to lots and lots of people all at the same time in a broadcast sense, an unproblematic message, you might find it more useful to go for something which has low information richness. Why? Because you can frame the message in such a way that it's going to be perceived by everyone at the same time in the same way. Now, it turns out some of these things don't actually allow advertising, but that's the thought behind it. Okay. So, we've seen some different ways of like dividing up or redescribing and theorizing media in terms of mediation, media richness, self-presentation. I wanted to move on just to another media theory, one which has been really influential. And it's associated with this guy. His name is Marshall McLuhan. He was an academic, but he was also a consultant to what brands. And McLuhan's argument was that different types of media have different social implications. They do different things in society, and they allow societies to do different things. The best example of this is a light bulb. McLuhan says a light bulb, you might not think it, but a light bulb is a media channel. Why is it a media channel? Because you can express a message with a light bulb. So when I walk past my colleagues' offices, if their light isn't on, I think they're not in. That's a message that I've taken from the light bulb. If you're driving along the street and you see a red light, what do? Stop. Because that light bulb has given you a message, said stop. If the light bulb turns to a green light bulb, what happens? You go. A light bulb can express a message. But once you have light bulbs, think about how different the world becomes. Before we had light bulbs, so if you took all the light bulbs away in this room, what happens? It gets really dark. What happens? What's that projector? It's a light bulb. The lecture becomes very different. The message that I can deliver becomes very different. Imagine it's 6 o'clock at night in December, right? There's no light here. Can we have the lecture? No, we can't have the lecture. As soon as you've got a light bulb, the whole world changes. McLuhan says this is the same of all media. Once you have TV, the world is different from before you had TV. Once you have the radio, the world is different from before you had the radio. Once you had a book, the world is different from before you had a book. Interestingly, McLuhan argues that branding, marketing, and advertising is a media of its own. It's a media which has its own message or its own social implications. And a lot of what he says relates back to things we talked about last week and the week previous to that, when we talked about sociology and the social implications of marketing. But McLuhan says what marketing and branding and advertising does as a form of media is it takes over other types of media and changes them to become marketing, branding, and advertising. So he said, well, he didn't say this, but a good example is the internet. The internet was developed in the 1960s. It was released to the public in the early 1990s. Until the mid to late 1990s, you weren't allowed to advertise at all on the internet. You couldn't even say, does anybody want to buy my old car? Like, you couldn't even send emails saying that. That was outlawed on the internet. There was no advertising at all. It was all about sharing information. In the last 15 years, they opened up the internet for advertising, and the whole internet's completely changed. The whole internet's completely changed, and the meaning of it has completely changed. Right? Once you add advertising and branding to a type of media, McLuhan argues, that type of media eventually just becomes branding and marketing. And reflecting this, in many media applications, there's usually some kind of governance or some rules about what brands and advertisers can do. And this is, in media theory, often described as the division of church and state. So in political theory, it's a metaphor that comes from political theory, you have a division between the church, religion, and the state. And this has been used in media theory to say in lots of media applications you'll have a division between the advertising bit and the other media bit. The best example of this is newspapers. Traditionally, newspapers were organised as two separate organisations, newspapers which had advertising. So you can have a newspaper which does journalism, right? And then consumers of that newspaper pay for the journalism. That's one style of having a newspaper. So if you all pay me £10, I have like £800, I can live for the month, and then I can write some stories that you can all read in my newspaper. Historically, though, what's happened is lots of newspapers have found there's not enough people that want to pay enough money for the news for them to do journalism. So instead, they have also added advertising into the newspaper. And the advertisers pay the newspaper to do journalism to then advertise to the people. But here's the problem. Journalists are supposed to be finding out the truth about the world. What are advertisers trying to do? Persuade people. Right? So, what do you think would happen if a journalist found out that one of their advertisers was doing something very unethical? Would they write about it in the newspaper, or would they not? It's a difficult one. And to stop them having to even ask that question, the way that most newspapers would be organised is by dividing the two things up. So they divide them up and say, well, we have these journalists that are trying to find out the truth. And that's all they do. And then we have a business side, which sells advertising space to advertisers. And if the advertiser doesn't like what the journalists write, that's fine. They don't have to continue doing business with us. That's traditionally how things have worked. Why? Because if, as McLuhan says, branding, marketing, communications can take over another type of media and make it only about persuasion, what happens to journalists? They're no longer trying to find the truth, they're just trying to persuade people. They just become advertising agents. So you create this division between the two, a firewall in today's language, and say you can have the adverts, and then you can have the other media. Not just in newspapers, in entertainment media. In the UK, lots of other countries, you have the show, and then you have the ad break. You have the commercial break. And the two don't mix with each other. In fact, in the UK, for many years, you couldn't have any brands, and when I was little, you couldn't have any brands in TV shows at all. And still today, like if you listen to the BBC, if they say one brand, they'll often say, and other brands are also available. Because they don't want to be seen to be favouring one brand over another, because that would be persuasion, not journalism or entertainment. So McLuhan offers a social theory of the media. And what McLuhan does and his followers is try to look at how does branding and marketing communications relate to other forms of media? What happens when you introduce branding into is a permitted use of a media? What happens to it? And what they often find is that there's a tension between the original meaning of the media, like the internet, the original meaning was to share information, against the branding application, which is to persuade people. So the original meaning of newspapers and journalism is to reveal the truth about the world. Once you start having advertising in it, you get this tension between the two. And you can understand a lot of rules about media as trying to alleviate that tension, right, through this division of church and state. And I mention this because we're going to see one of the trends in recent years has been for this division to be eroded. Okay, so we've looked at some broad theories of media, forms of mediation, media richness, applied it to social media, and then McLuhan's social theory of the media. Let's start to look at some of the contemporary research which has used media theory to understand media as it applies to branding and marketing communications. Historically, we've had this shift where original markets have a direct relationship. When you get advertising and brands emerge, it was around broadcast media. And we've now seen this move to social media, reflected earlier on. And this move has definitely been reflected in academic research, particularly in the area of interactivity. So in broadcast media, it's a one-way relationship. I'm the advertiser, I say something, you will listen to it. In social media, the senders and receivers can switch places. So you can start to have feedback loops. And the way that that's described or conceptualized in branding and marketing communications is through interactions. Consumers can now interact with advertising messages through the media channel. Not in their heads, but through the media channel. Of course, consumers could always interact with them and they could interpret and reinterpret messages as they chose. But now with the move to many media, social media, consumers can interact back with brands. What we think about this is the different types of responses that new media allow. So traditionally, we'll talk about some of these in more depth in a couple of weeks. Traditionally, brands and marketing communicators didn't really measure how many people have been exposed to their messages, actually exposed. And the reason for that was practical. If you put an advert in a newspaper, how do you know how many people have read the newspaper? Like, you might know how many copies of the newspaper have been sold, but does everybody who reads a newspaper buy a newspaper? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that provides a minimum measure. If you look at sales, technically it's called reach. What's the reach of the media? How many people buy it? What about a TV station? If you're watching not a digital TV station, an old TV station with an aerial, how do you know how many people have seen your advert? You wouldn't have to buy it. A bit more tricky, isn't it? Because even if you knew how many people had the TV on, which you don't, but even if you did know that, how many people sit and watch all the adverts when they come on? Not that many, right? So it's kind of difficult to understand. Traditional media didn't have any ways, not just of consumers to talk back to brands, but even for brands to how many people they reached. So one way was to look at sales, and for some media channels you could look at sales. But for others they did estimations. So what they would do is they would get, there were service providers who would pay a group of consumers, maybe 1,000 consumers, to keep diaries about what they watched. This is called audience research. In the 1980s, they started putting devices on top of people's TVs, which would measure what they were watching. And then they would literally just multiply that to the general population. Right? So they'd say, out of our 1,000 people in our panel, 50% watched football. Therefore, we'll say, out of the entire UK population, which is 60 million people, 50% watched the football. So 30 million people watched the football. This was the basis of what's called CPM, which is a standard way of measuring audiences. And it's basically an estimate of the number of 1,000 people watching something. But as a brand, that's not very useful information, really. Just based on panel information. And all you know is roughly how many people have watched something. You don't know whether they liked it, whether they accepted it, whether they actually listened to it. You don't have any of that information. even if we go back to newspapers, you know how many people have bought the newspaper. You might be able to estimate how many people have read the newspaper based on that. But do you know how many people read the advert on page 27? Do you know if it's worth to pay more for an advert on page 1 rather than page 2? No, you don't have any of that information. Well, new digital social media are different because they have the benefits of them, because they allow those relationships backwards. Brands could start to measure and calculate and understand how effective their adverts were. So, just on a simple web page, you can count how many people have viewed the web page, how many people have gone onto the web page. So you have a much more accurate measure than any other measure for traditional media. Because each time you go on a web page, it counts. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can see how many people have viewed the web page. You can count things like engagement. Digital media allows marketers to measure things like the bounce rate. And the bounce rate is the number of people that have stayed on a web page for more than 5 seconds. Why? Because in the same way that social media lets the receiver send a message back, it lets the media channel itself monitor that message. So you can measure how long somebody's on the web page for. You can measure where their mouse moves over a web page. People produce heat maps of web pages. These are measures of engagement. You can measure the number of times somebody clicks on something on your web page. On social media, you can measure whether people share your branded content to their friends, whether they become senders of your message themselves. You can measure whether they add a comment, talk about it on their blog, whether they like it, all these things. So digital media were really, really popular for brands because they allowed them to much more accurately measure what people were doing with their marketing communications. So now they could tell, is it worth more to advertise on one web page versus another? Do they get more views? Do they get more engagement? Do they get more likes and shares? Researchers, though, typically don't have this level of information, so researchers tend to use things like intention to click on something and intention to share it. But the basis behind the research, if you look at in a second, is the same. The idea that you can use these measures to understand what works. And if you can measure what works, think back to behavioural research, you can start to tell a particular types of stimuli more effective than others. So in the early 2000s, researchers proposed this model called the interactive advertising model. I don't want to go through it in too much depth, only to suggest the following to you. It starts off with sort of general psychological theory, well established in kind of marketing communications, type we've already talked about. So the cognitive tools, hopefully you know what these words mean. We talked about attention, memory, we talked about attitudes on the course of events. Then they said there's some things on interactive media which advertisers control. What do they control? They can choose the format of that ad. They can choose where it appears and when it's appeared. They can choose the type of advert that they are trying to communicate. So they're trying to promote a product or a political cause. And then they can think about the features, the rhetoric inside the adverts. And your traditional advertising models would usually stop there. In fact, many of them would use things like attitude, memory, and attention as outputs of the advertising process as well. But interactive advertising allows you to measure other kinds of outcomes, right? Now you can measure engagement, clicks, whether they send an email in or whether they comment back. You've got all these other outcomes that you can measure. So you look at this, you probably think, well, it kind of looks like makes sense. This is the important bit. This extra thing, these interactive measures which the consumer controls. And this has led researchers to go back to many of their ideas about what creates a memorable advertising campaign or what changes consumers' attitudes. And rather than asking about their memory or attitude at the end, they check to see whether memorable ads create more interaction, more clicks, more engagements, and so on and so forth. Often they'll use intention to click or intention to comment because they don't actually have the data though. And this has revealed some interesting differences between new media and traditional broadcast media. One which is worth emphasising is relevance and personalisation. One of the things that researchers have found through the use of interactive measures is that if a consumer perceives the advert to be of relevance to them, it's much more effective. So those broadcast messages where you send one message to everybody, it turns out were quite ineffective because lots of people didn't care. If you can target particular groups of people with a message that's relevant to them and their needs, it's much more likely to get some kind of interaction or engagement, it turns out. And this is why lots of the things we were talking about earlier on around targeted advertising are being given support by academic researchers and popular practitioners. The belief is, if you can target your advertising to make it relevant to a consumer so that they think it's relevant to them, it's more likely to be effective. Okay. Another thing which researchers here have tried to add into traditional models, which I like here, is they call it herd behaviour, or how much does the impact of other people's actions on social media impact your own actions. So if you know everybody's talking about this advert, does it make you want to go and watch it? If all your friends are saying, I've just bought this new brand, does it make you want to go and buy the new brand? So here they call it herd behaviour. Do you know what a herd is? Yeah, like a group of animals almost, right? And the idea here is that you can get, once you get people together, as we saw in social psychology, they will do things and believe things which perhaps no one individual would do. So here, we sometimes talk about viral advertising. You get this big wave where once one or two people start doing things, the third person's more likely to do it, and then it becomes a big wave of things. So the emphasis there is on getting people, getting consumers, start acting like a group around advertising, and again, it increases its effectiveness. Now this then is a bit of a tension in social media research. On the one hand, making something personally relevant to individuals makes it more effective. On the other hand, encouraging this herd group behaviour makes it more effective as well. So, looking at these measures of interactivity are starting to allow researchers to discover new elements, new factors which drive the success of branding and marketing communications. Until we had these measures of interactivity, the traditional theories of advertising, which we looked at in week 2, they didn't talk about relevance and personalisation because they couldn't get that level of data. They didn't talk about the effect of herd behaviours because they didn't see them, because they were just looking at broadcast messages where you never got a message back from the consumers. Okay. So researchers are now trying to understand, and practitioners, what's the most effective way to use social media to encourage group behaviour, to personalise messages, and they haven't really come up with the best answer there. One group of researchers are trying to look descriptively, well, what seems to work? What kinds of marketing strategies and marketing messages seem to work best on social media? So there's research, and here's just a couple of examples of it, looking at the different types of selling strategies that brands tend to use. And they found, for example, that functional appeals tend to be quite high up on the list, which sort of seems counterintuitive, but functional appeals are things which really focus on the, the actual practical benefits of something. YouTube, a couple of years ago, did a big study into this, and they suggested that the best way to exploit the effectiveness of social media, now we've started to understand it because we've got this data, we've got this new interactive data, is to realize not everything goes viral. There isn't one single piece, but there's a range of different uses. And they suggested that what effective brands should do is generate what they call hub, hero, and hygiene content. So I'll just talk through those real quickly because this is quite an influential idea in practice. Hero content is branded content delivered through social networks which you want to go viral. So this will often cost millions of dollars, and they'll have celebrities in it, and it will be these fantastic kind of Super Bowl style adverts. And the aim is that it's going to go viral, that you'll get those herd effects, people sharing it. Even if it's not relevant to somebody, it's not a brand they're going to engage with, it's just really cool content and it will get shared by lots and lots of people. That's called hero content. YouTube's point is, not all content can be hero content, nor should it be. They said you should also have what they call hygiene content, which is really functional content about how to use your laptop, how to set up your phone. Because actually consumers want that and they find it useful, but a much smaller group of consumers. So that hygiene content has to be really relevant to consumers. If you know, for example, that people are skeptical about a new product, have lots of instructional videos showing how to use it, how it works on the social media platform. Push that, try to target skeptical consumers with those messages. That's hygiene content. And then the hub content sits in between the two. So we often, for consumers which are likely to buy a product or already bought a product, that have a particular kind of requirement about it. Not necessarily a practical how to do something, but more of a reinforcement approach. Remember when we talked about the ATR model? Reinforcing something. So it's not this huge campaign that you're expecting to go viral, but amongst a particular group of consumers, it is going to reinforce that they've made a good choice. That your brand is a top brand, that their product works as they expected. So hero, hub, hygiene. Not everything goes viral. There are different strategies and uses. It's emerging. Now the research into interactive media is developing. Okay. One of the other big areas which has been revealed through interactive studies is the importance of word of mouth. It turns out consumers often trust other consumers more than they trust brands. So if you can get other consumers sharing branded content, they're more likely to persuade their friends and family than a brand will. This is called word of mouth. Sometimes it's called e-word of mouth. I don't personally like that, but some people like it. Electronic word of mouth is what the E stands for. And why is that the case? Well, we actually already know that that's the case. We know from the persuasion knowledge model, which I think we might have talked about on the course already, that when consumers recognize something is trying to persuade them, and that's what a sender is trying to do, they tend to be quite skeptical. When they notice that there's a rhetorical style to persuasion, or that a media tends to be used by brands and marketing communicators, they become skeptical of it. And the effectiveness of that rhetorical style or that media channel diminishes. It's called the persuasion knowledge model. The more knowledge somebody has about persuasion, the less persuasive the technique is. That's what it's called. And so brands traditionally have always been having to try to find new, innovative ways to engage with consumers. Traditionally, that was in the content of the adverts. over the last couple of decades, it's been around different ways of using media, using social media, opening up not just broadcast media, but interactive media as well. So how do consumers diminish the effectiveness of marketing communications? How is it that once they've got knowledge of something, they can resist it? Well, this links to a body of research on advertising avoidance. And it goes back to what we were talking about before around how do you measure the effectiveness of marketing communications. Researchers have found that when consumers recognise something is an advert and they feel it's not relevant to them, they'll tend to do one of three things. They'll either cognitively avoid it, and that literally means they won't pay attention to it. So if you think back to psychological theory when we had peripheral and central root processing, if you don't centrally process a message, that is cognitively avoiding it. So if you look at something and you think that looks like an advert, or you're on YouTube and an advert comes on before your video and you just don't pay attention to it, that's cognitive avoidance. Behavioural avoidance is actually doing something to stop yourself being exposed to an advert. Like clicking on the skip the advert button. Or, if you're watching TV and some adverts come on, you get up and you walk out the room and make a cup of coffee or smoke a cigarette or talk to your girlfriend or something. That's behavioural avoidance. Cognitive avoidance is using your mind. Behavioural avoidance is actually changing your behaviour to avoid the advert once you recognise that it's branding marketing. And finally, there's mechanical avoidance. Mechanical avoidance means using a media to avoid marketing communications. So if you're watching TV and an advert break comes on, commercial break, and you've got a remote control in your hand, what do? Change the channel. That's mechanical avoidance. Marketers have always had to understand these avoidances and work with them. So when there was, do you guys remember videos? Do you know what a video is? Like a videotape? You don't know. It doesn't matter. But, so there's these things called videotapes, and you could record TV shows on videotapes, and then you could watch them back. And you could fast forward things, so you could make it go fast so you didn't have to watch it. Marketers very quickly realised that when people videoed TV shows, they skipped through all the ads. They called this zapping. Zapping, right? They would skip through all the adverts. Zap. Why don't these pens work on screen? Zapping. And they responded to it. So one of the things that they did was, the original ways of fast forwarding, it showed you what was happening on the screen, but it was all sped up. So what advertisers started doing was having 30-second adverts that literally would just have their brand logo on it. So that when you were fast forwarding through it, it just showed the brand logo. And nothing happened, right? But then you get things like TiVo boxes or DVR boxes where you can automatically skip advertising. It was estimated in one study that once you had a TiVo box, so you could, digital recorder where you could say just don't show me the adverts, 90% of adverts went unwatched. Pretty crazy. And this has led practitioners, so I should say, to develop some new strategies to try to get their content in front of consumers, understanding the importance of word of mouth, understanding the importance of relevance, and understanding that if consumers think something's trying to persuade them, they're less likely to be persuaded. They've changed their behaviours. And this is demonstrated in what's called the POEM strategy of marketing communications. The P of POEM stands for paid marketing communications. And here, brands pay media providers to put their brands into the content. So an example would be product placement in a TV show. Why does product placement in a TV show work? because it cannot be mechanically avoided. Right, so you can skip through the commercial break, but then when you're watching the show, if there's a brand in it, you've been exposed to it. You might still cognitively avoid it, but it gets rid of mechanical avoidance. Okay? A more recent example of this in terms of the news media is what's called native advertising, where there are new media channels like the Huffington Post and BuzzFeed are two of them, where that division of church and state is completely done away with. And on something like BuzzFeed, a brand can pay for an article as well as a journalist write an article. And the two things are meant to look the same as each other. It's called native advertising because the advert is within, hidden, the content itself. So this whole article and everything you didn't know about PlayStation was written by Sony and put in the next post. And it's made to look indistinguishable from all the other content that's on BuzzFeed, even though the whole thing is an advert. The whole article is an advert that's been paid for by Sony.
So the native advertising is like the article written by someone for the purpose of advertising.
Yeah, by the brand itself, exactly. Why does this work? Because it reduces cognitive avoidance. Because this doesn't look like an advert, it looks like an article. So it reduces cognitive avoidance. The O of the POEM model stands for owned media. And one of the things which has happened in recent years is brands have started to develop their own media content. Rather than paying BuzzFeed to write an article for them, they just make it themselves. So lots and lots of brands, I won't show it, this is an example, BMW, they created their own movie series. And there's about 20 movies that they made. And they're just available for you to watch on their YouTube channel. But the whole thing is designed by the brand. It's got BMWs all in it. But if you like BMW or you want to watch a free movie, it's there for you to do. That's owned media. Owned media is different from paid media. In paid media, the brand pays somebody else to either write, develop, or distribute their content for them. In owned media, they do it themselves. There's lots of examples. This movie, Chef. It's an awful movie. Don't watch it. But it was bizarrely in the middle of it. There's like this big, very long scene where people are using Twitter all the time, and this business owner he's got a really successful business, and then he goes on Twitter, and people start sharing how great his business is, and he becomes really successful. Well, it turns out the movie was actually paid for by Twitter. It's a whole, when you realise that, it's just one big long advert that Twitter paid for. I made the mistake of going to watch it at the cinema and paying money, and you felt rather exploited. But again, why does this work? Because when I went to the cinema to watch it, I just thought, I like Jon Favreau, he's in some of my favourite films. This is a film. I paid my money, it looked like a normal film. I didn't cognitively avoid it. It was only halfway through when I realised it was a big advert for Twitter that I started to cognitively avoid it. So we've done P is paid, O is owned, E is earned media. And this is really what brands are going for because it's word of mouth media. Earned media is where you get others to promote your brand for you. That might be through writing reviews, which if you want to write reviews for my book, as long as they're 5-star, that would be highly encouraged. You write reviews. This is media, right? This is a positive message about my book. In the past, I might have had to pay a newspaper to review the book for me. And now, consumers do it for us. This is called earned media space. It's earned because the brand doesn't have to pay for it, they get it for free. They earn the media space for free. Again, this minimizes cognitive avoidance because consumers typically think a review is an advert. They think it's a review by another consumer. Although one of the big controversies on Amazon is brands can go and manipulate these things and get fake people to write fake reviews for them, which again, if you want to do for my book, I don't mind. But this has been one of the responses that we've had amongst media practitioners based on the understanding developed through interactive measures of marketing communications. And understanding things like the importance of the herd, word of mouth, getting consumers talking to each other, promoting the brand. Understanding the importance of relevance. Right? People that like these actors, like me, will go and watch this, and hopefully they'll be the types of people that will start using Twitter, which I don't, by the way. So, I've actually talked for too long. I'm going to suggest that I pick the rest of the class up next week because we've come to a good break point, okay? Does that work for everybody? Yeah? So, we've got quite a few things to go through, but I can go through these quickly. What we've looked at today, if you look at media theory, we spent quite a bit of time talking about media theory and the assignment, why I've not been able to do the last bit. And theories of new and social media. So we looked at media theory, mediation, media richness, Marshall McLuhan's social meaning of media, and then we've looked at new interactive measures which have allowed marketing communicators to begin innovating their theories and understanding of how marketing communications works, to understand the importance of relevance and the herd. What we'll do next week is we'll start thinking about some of the critiques of marketing communications and its relationship to the media. I've got a few good examples, some good stuff there. If you've got any questions, I'll be outside, feel free to ask me. I'm probably going to go to my office and collapse for a bit because I'm poorly. Thanks for your attention. Email me if you've got any questions about the assignment, and I'll see you next week and we'll finish this class up. Thanks. Bye.